Welcome back to Restoring British Health, the investigative podcast that pulls apart what's really in our food, our water, and our supply chain. If I asked you to picture a Cadbury's Dairy Milk bar, you'd know exactly what I meant. Purple wrapper, glass and a half of milk, made in Bourneville, as British as a cup of tea. And if I asked you to picture a Toffee Crisp, or a Blue Riband, or a Penguin biscuit, or a Club, you'd know those too. They've been in lunchboxes and biscuit tins in this country for generations. Here's the problem. In the space of a single year in 2025, every single one of those products that I just mentioned was quietly reformulated. And in most cases, they can no longer even be called chocolate. That's not hyperbole. That is a literal statement of UK food law. Toffee Crisp, Blue Riband, Penguin, Club, White Kit Kat Chunky, McVitie's White Chocolate Digestives, all of them. Every one had its recipe changed, its cocoa content reduced, and its packaging quietly updated. Where they once said milk chocolate, they can now only say chocolate flavour coating. And before anyone says, well, you can hardly call it news that companies cut costs, this episode isn't about that. It's about something deeper. It's about how a national institution, the British chocolate bar, has been systematically hollowed out by multinational corporations. At the same time, prices have risen 40, 50, sometimes 60%, all while the products themselves have actually shrunk, during which the regulatory framework has done absolutely nothing to stop any of it. So let's break this down properly, because once you see what's actually happened to the chocolate aisle in your local supermarket, you're going to look at it very, very differently. In December of 2025, Nestlé confirmed it had reformulated Toffee Crisp and Blue Riband. They reduced the cocoa mass. They increased the proportion of vegetable fats, and the change meant that neither product could legally be described as containing milk chocolate under UK food law, because UK law requires a minimum of 20% cocoa solids and 20% milk solids for that designation. So the packaging was quietly updated. Where it once read, covered in milk chocolate, it now reads, encased in a smooth milk chocolate flavour coating. Again, smooth milk chocolate flavour coating. The word flavour doing a lot of heavy lifting in that sentence. Nestlé was not alone. 2 months earlier, in October of 2025, McVitie's owner, Pladis, reformulated Penguin and Club biscuits, two of the most recognisable chocolate-coated biscuit bars in Britain. They replaced the chocolate coating with a cheaper alternative that fell below the legal threshold for chocolate. Both products now carry the description chocolate flavour coating. And here's the bit that genuinely made me laugh out loud when I read it. Club biscuits were forced to retire their famous slogan, the one I grew up with. If you like a lot of chocolate on your biscuit, join our club. Retired, because there is no longer enough chocolate on the biscuit to legally make the claim. Earlier in 2025, Nestlé had already rebranded Kit Kat Chunky White. They removed the word chocolate from the front of the packaging. White chocolate simply became white. McVitie's had also removed cocoa butter entirely from its white chocolate digestives, so those have been rebranded as just white digestives. And every manufacturer cited the same justification: soaring cocoa prices. And yes, global cocoa prices did spike dramatically. They reached a record of approximately $12,000 per tonne in January of 2025 after poor harvests in West Africa. But here's what they don't tell you. By the time most of these reformulations actually reached supermarket shelves, cocoa prices had already fallen roughly 45% from that peak. They were sitting at around $5,000 to $6,000 per tonne. Still elevated, but nowhere near the crisis level cited as justification. And not a single one of these reformulations has been reversed. The cocoa prices came down, the chocolate did not come back. Now, industry analysts have two terms for what's happening here, and it's worth knowing them because they're happening to you simultaneously every time you go shopping. Shrinkflation, where the product gets physically smaller while the price stays the same or rises, and skimpflation, where the size may or may not change, but the ingredients inside are systematically degraded. Data collected by market researchers Associa across Tesco, Sainsbury's, Asda and Morrisons between December of 2021 and December of 2025 reveals the scale of this in numbers that you can't argue with. Cadbury's Dairy Milk Bar shrank by 10% in weight, from 200 grams down to 180, all while the price rose 48%, from £1.86 to £2.75. Mars Celebrations tubs shrank by 23%, while the price rose 44%. Terry's Chocolate Orange reduced by 8% in size, the price up 51%. A 2023 study found that 73% of British shoppers had noticed smaller portion sizes, while prices either stayed the same or increased. And the most affected category? Chocolate, identified by 56% of the respondents. Now, Mondelez International, Cadbury's American parent company, who acquired Cadbury's via a controversial Kraft hostile takeover back in 2010 for £11.5 billion, they have acknowledged that product size reductions are happening, but they describe them as a last resort. Their spokesperson said the company had, quote, had to make the decision to slightly reduce the weight of some products so that we can continue to provide consumers with the brands they love without compromising on the great taste and quality they expect. Yeah, right. Without compromising on quality while replacing cocoa butter with palm oil? Sure. But here's where it gets more interesting. Because researchers in December of 2025 actually did the maths. They looked at whether these price increases were proportionate to the rise in ingredient costs. Their finding? Here we go. Until early 2024, retail price increases were roughly half the rise in wholesale ingredient costs. So that period, broadly proportionate. After early 2024, however, further retail price hikes were, quote, much less clearly justified by ingredient costs alone. At their peak, ingredient cost increases added approximately 10 to 15 pence per 100 grams compared with 2021. But by late 2025, the retail price per 100 grams had risen approximately 60 pence above the 2021 levels. We'll do the maths. The portion of that increase explained by actual ingredients was 10 to 15 pence. The portion you actually paid was around 60 pence. The gap, in the researchers' own words, reflects other costs and choices, including decisions by manufacturers and retailers about margins and pack sizes. So let's consider the bigger picture. Mondelez International reported full year 2025 revenues of approximately $38.5 billion, up 5.75% year on year. The company returned $4.7 billion to shareholders in 2024 alone, through dividends and share buybacks. Cadbury's parent company is not, in other words, a struggling enterprise forced into desperate cost-cutting. It is a corporation making strategic margin decisions, while telling you that ingredient degradation is an unavoidable response to forces beyond its control. So to understand how dramatically British chocolate has been degraded, we need to understand the legal flaw, the minimum standards, the line beneath which a product cannot legally use the word chocolate at all. Under the Cocoa and Chocolate Products Regulations of 2003, these are the minimums. Dark chocolate, not less than 35% total dry cocoa solids, including not less than 18% cocoa butter. Milk chocolate, the standard EU rule, not less than 25% total dry cocoa solids and 14% dry milk solids. But the UK secured a historical derogation, an alternative standard, the 2020 rule. 20% cocoa solids and 20% milk solids. White chocolate, not less than 20% cocoa butter and 14% milk solids. These are minimums. They represent the absolute floor. Now here's the critical point. These minimum standards already represent a significant concession to industrial manufacturing. A bar meeting the absolute minimum threshold for milk chocolate under the UK's 2020 rule contains by weight 60% ingredients that are not cocoa or milk, predominantly sugar and fat. That is what UK milk chocolate at the legal minimum actually is. 40% the stuff you think of as chocolate, 60% everything else. And both EU and UK regulations permit the addition of up to 5% vegetable fats other than cocoa butter. Things derived from palm, shea, elepe, sal, kokumgurgi, and mango kernel, as long as it's declared on the packaging. So the legal floor was already low. The legal floor permitted up to 5% palm oil and shea fat, and manufacturers have spent years pushing right up to that ceiling. And then, in 2025, they did something even more brazen. They fell below the legal floor entirely. Because here's the thing that nobody told you. There is no minimum cocoa requirement for the term chocolate flavour coating. None. There is no compositional standard at all. The manufacturer needs only enough cocoa-derived material to justify the word chocolate appearing somewhere before flavour on the label. The regulatory framework, in effect, creates a trap door. Fall below the minimum for chocolate and you enter unregulated space, where the product can contain virtually anything and still trade on chocolate's name. Still sit on the same shelf, still command the same price, still wear the same wrapper your dad recognized. It's unacceptable. Now contrast all of this with our European neighbours, because the comparison is, frankly, embarrassing. Under the standard EU rule, milk chocolate must contain at least 25% total dry cocoa solids. The UK's 2020 derogation, the 20% rule, that was specifically negotiated to accommodate British manufacturers' long-standing practice of producing milk chocolate with lower cocoa content. In practical terms, what this means is a bar sold as milk chocolate in France, in Belgium, in Germany, in Italy must contain at least 25% cocoa solids. The same designation in the UK can be achieved with 20. So before any manufacturer makes a single quality decision, the continental consumer is guaranteed 25%. More cocoa by regulatory default. Same word, same product category, different country, different chocolate. And the EU enforces things that we don't. Maximum cadmium levels in chocolate, scaled to cocoa content, brought in through Regulation 488 of 2014, then strengthened by Regulation 2023-915. The UK retained these limits as assimilated law after Brexit, but enforcement capacity and the trajectory of future regulatory alignment, those remain very much open questions. And on heavy metals more broadly, the picture is genuinely alarming. Consumer Reports testing in the United States found lead and cadmium in all 28 dark chocolate bars they tested. 23 of those 28 exceeded levels that public health authorities consider potentially harmful for at least one heavy metal, from a single daily ounce. A 2024 study in Frontiers in Nutrition tested 72 dark chocolate products over 7 years. 43% of these exceeded the maximum allowable dose levels for lead. 35% exceeded them for cadmium. Heavy metal contamination in chocolate has shown no meaningful improvement over time. But where the continental comparison really gets stark is not in the legal minimums, it's in market culture. Belgium, Switzerland, France, Germany. These are countries that maintain deeply embedded artisanal and industrial chocolate traditions, where cocoa content, cocoa butter purity, and milk quality are treated as competitive differentiators, as things to be proud of, as things consumers can actually choose between. Belgian chocolate, regulated under the Belgian Chocolate Code, a voluntary industry standard that goes substantially beyond EU minimums, typically contains 35% of more cocoa solids, even in milk chocolate, with no vegetable fat substitution at all. In Britain, the competitive dynamic runs in the opposite direction, dominated by 4 multinational conglomerates: Mondelez, who own Cadbury; Nestlé, who own Kit Kat, Toffee Crisp, Blue Riband; Mars and Pladis, who own McVitie's. The market incentivizes cost reduction, not quality competition. The result? A race to the regulatory floor. And in 2025, through the floor entirely. No brand illustrates this more completely than Cadbury, because no British brand has been so thoroughly hollowed out from the inside. Cadbury was founded in Birmingham in 1824 by John Cadbury, a Quaker, who built a village at Bourneville to provide his workers with improved living conditions, decent housing, schools, open space, and clean air. The company spent nearly 2 centuries establishing itself as one of Britain's most trusted brands. The dairy milk bar, introduced in 1905 with a higher proportion of milk than any rival product, became the country's best-selling chocolate bar. Then, in 2010, Kraft Foods launched a controversial hostile takeover bid. They acquired Cadbury for £11.5 billion. The acquisition faced widespread public opposition at the time. Trade union Unite estimated it could put 30,000 jobs at risk. Kraft had to borrow £7 billion just to finance the deal. Controversially funded in part by RBS, a bank that was at the time 84% owned by the UK government. So yes, the government indirectly helped finance the takeover of one of Britain's most iconic companies. Within weeks of completing the acquisition, Kraft announced the closure of Cadbury's Somerdale factory in Keynsham, with the loss of 400 jobs, despite having given assurances during the takeover process that production would be maintained at UK sites. Production was moved to Poland. Kraft was subsequently censured by the panel on takeovers and mergers. Then, in 2012, Kraft split itself into 2 companies. Its snack and confectionery division became Mondelez International, and Cadbury became a subsidiary of that. What happened next? Well, it's a bit of a list, so you'll have to bear with me, because each item on this list is something that the British public in their thousands have noticed and complained about. Production of multiple Cadbury products, including dairy milk bars sold in the UK, had been moved to Poland. In 2015, Mondelez changed the recipe for the Cadbury cream eggshell. They switched from dairy milk chocolate to what the company described as standard cocoa mix chocolate, a cheaper formulation. In 2019, Cadbury dropped its fair trade commitment, replacing it with a less rigorous in-house ethical trading program. In August of 2025, the grocer reported that Cadbury's Bourneville dark chocolate bar had its ingredient list amended. Cocoa butter moved further down the list, palm oil moved up, indicating a changed proportion, despite Cadbury insisting the recipe was, quote, unchanged. And then, in December 2024, came the symbolic blow. Cadbury lost its royal warrant, held continuously since Queen Victoria first granted it in 1854. This was following a King Charles's review of warrant holders. 171 years of royal warrant gone. No specific reason was given, as is royal protocol, but the warrant's revocation followed years of criticism over outsourced production, shrinking products, and recipe changes. And to put that in context, confectioners Bendix, Prestat, and Nestlé retained their warrants. Cadbury did not. The consumer reaction has been emphatic. On Trustpilot, Cadbury's rating reflects widespread dissatisfaction, with reviews consistently describing the product as, quote, oily, waxy, sickly, and barely recognizable compared to what it once was. One reviewer summed it up nicely. A worldwide celebrated product until it was bought out and gradually destroyed. Apart from the fact that the milk content is reduced in favor of palm oil, it can no longer be classified and called chocolate. Mondelez insists it has not changed the core dairy milk recipe. Consumers in their thousands disagree. And as a country, we should ask ourselves a very serious question. How did we let this happen? How did we let a 200-year-old British institution founded by a Quaker philanthropist on principles of dignified work and quality production be bought up, asset stripped, recipe degraded, factory relocated, and have its royal warrant stripped, all without any meaningful resistance? So we need to talk about something that connects this episode directly to a previous one in the series, the drinking water episode, episode 3, because there is an invisible ingredient in British confectionery that nobody talks about: tap water. Across the wider confectionery aisle, in toffees, in caramels, in fondants, in fudge, in boiled sweets, in gummies, in marshmallows, and in the fillings of countless chocolate products. Water is a fundamental manufacturing ingredient. It dissolves sugar, it creates syrups, it forms the basis of glucose solutions. It determines texture and water activity. It defines whether a sweet is hard, chewy, or soft. And in industrial confectionery production in Britain, that water comes from the main supply, the same treated tap water I covered in episode 3. Now, if you remember from that episode, British tap water achieves a 99.97% regulatory compliance rate. But it's compliant with standards that fail to account for the cumulative burden of contaminants present at sub-regulatory levels, things like PFAS, the so-called forever chemicals, for which the UK has no statutory legal limit. The UK guidance threshold is 25 times more lenient than the enforceable US standards. Pharmaceutical residues, including antidepressants that are not routinely tested for. Microplastics averaging 57 particles per litre with no monitoring standard at all. Trihalomethanes, the carcinogenic byproducts of the chlorine disinfection process itself. And this bit should genuinely concern you, because when the water is then used in confectionery manufacturing and boiled or reduced as it is in the production of caramel, toffee, and boiled sweets, some volatile contaminants may evaporate, but others concentrate. PFAS, by definition, are resistant to degradation. That's why they're called forever chemicals. They don't break down. Heavy metals present in water similarly persist and concentrate as water evaporates during sugar boiling. So the industrial process does not purify these contaminants out. It may actually intensify them. And here's the regulatory horror. No confectionery manufacturer in the UK is required to test for PFAS, pharmaceutical residues, or microplastics in the water used for production. No finished product testing regime for confectionery examines these contaminants. The regulatory framework simply assumes the water supply is safe and imposes no obligation on food manufacturers to verify what that water actually contains beyond basic potability. Which means, for you, the consumer, an invisible pathway of exposure. A person who drinks tap water, eats a chocolate bar with water-based caramel filling, consumes sweets made from sugar syrup dissolved in tap water, and prepares hot chocolate with tap water is receiving multiple concurrent doses of the same unmonitored contaminants from the same source. And none of those exposures appear on any label. And none of them trigger any regulatory scrutiny. Now, as cocoa content has fallen and vegetable fats have replaced cocoa butter and milk, something has had to fill that space. And that something is overwhelmingly sugar. Chocolate and sweet confectionery together constitute one of the largest sources of sugar in British children's diets. Approximately 10% of total sugar intake for children aged 4 to 10 and 11% for teenagers. The UK government's voluntary sugar reduction programme, launched in 2015, targeted 20% reduction by 2020. The actual reduction achieved? An average of just 3% in retail food products, 0.3% in foods consumed outside the home. Just 3% against a 20% target. That is a comprehensive policy failure. Now, the government has since brought in mandatory restrictions on the promotion and placement of foods classified as high in sugar, fat, or salt. The HFSS rules. They banned prominent in-store placement from October of 2022. They introduced a pre-9 p.m. television advertising watershed and online advertising restrictions coming into force in January of this year. Volume price promotions, things like buy one get one free on HFSS products, banned from October of 2025. These measures address marketing and visibility. They do not address composition. And here is the regulatory gap that nobody is closing. There is no legal maximum sugar content for chocolate or confectionery in the UK. None. A manufacturer may reduce cocoa, they may replace milk fat with palm oil, they may increase sugar to compensate. As consumer reviews consistently allege, this is happening, without breaching any compositional regulation, because no such regulation exists. The result is a product that has become in measurable terms less nutritious and more calorific than what it replaced. The flavonols and antioxidants present in cocoa solids, the compounds that give dark chocolate its qualifying health reputation in the first place, those are precisely the components being reduced. What remains is an increasing proportion of sugar, vegetable fat, and emulsifiers. The ingredients of a confectionery product optimized for cost and shelf stability, not for the human being who eats it. So consider for a moment what the aggregate effect of all of this means. For the person standing in the supermarket aisle in Britain in 2026, the person you were last time you went to do the weekly shop, the chocolate bar in your hand contains less cocoa than the same product contained 5 years ago. It may now sit at or near the legal minimum for the designation of chocolate. If it's a coated biscuit bar, a penguin, a club, a Toffee Crisp, a blue Riband, it contains no chocolate at all by legal definition, only a chocolate flavour coating, made predominantly from vegetable fat. The product is physically smaller than it was, the price is 40 to 50% higher, the ingredient list features palm oil, shea oil, and emulsifiers, where cocoa butter and milk once appeared. The water used in manufacturing, present in every caramel, every toffee, every fondant filling, carries traces of PFAS, pharmaceutical residues, microplastics, and disinfection byproducts that no manufacturer tests for. No regulator requires disclosure of, and no labeling requirement communicates any of this to you. The company that makes the product, if it's Cadbury, is owned by an American multinational with $38.5 billion in annual revenue that returned $4.7 billion to shareholders in a single year, while telling you that ingredient degradation was a necessary response to costs beyond its control. That same company moved production to Poland, dropped its fair trade commitment, lost its royal warrant held since 1854, and insists on top of all of that, in the face of hundreds of thousands of consumer complaints, that it has not changed the recipe. And the regulatory framework permits all of this. The UK's chocolate compositional standards set a floor so low that a product can be 60% sugar and vegetable fat and still legally qualify as milk chocolate. The allowance for 5% vegetable fat substitution, originally introduced as a concession, has become an invitation. And products that fall below even these minimal thresholds simply change their label from chocolate to chocolate flavour and continue selling at the same price from the same shelf position. Continental European consumers purchasing from the same multinational manufacturers receive products made to higher minimum standards. 25% cocoa solids versus 20% for milk chocolate, within a market culture that treats ingredient quality as a point of competitive pride. The same companies that sell degraded products in Britain actually sell higher specification products in France and in Belgium and in Germany. Why? Because those markets demand it. Those consumers expect it. The British consumer, by contrast, has been trained over decades to accept progressively less cocoa, less milk, less product in the package, more sugar, more palm oil, more emulsifiers, more water of uncertain purity, and always, always a higher price. As we know, this series doesn't just document failure, it demands specific remedies. And on chocolate and confectionery, the following reforms, I believe, are necessary, achievable, and overdue. 1. Mandatory front-of-pack cocoa percentage labelling on every product sold as chocolate or bearing the word chocolate on its packaging. Not buried in the ingredients list, front of pack, clear, visible, so the consumer can see at a glance whether the bar in their hands contains 20% cocoa or 35%. If supermarkets can display traffic light nutritional labels, they can display the single number that tells you how much chocolate is actually in your chocolate. 2. A binding increase in minimum cocoa solids for milk chocolate, from 20% to the EU standard of 25%. The UK's historical derogation was a concession to manufacturers, not a protection for consumers. Post-Brexit, the UK has the power to raise that floor. It should exercise it. A 5-year transition period would give manufacturers time to reformulate. The direction of travel should be toward the European standard, not further beneath it. 3. Statutory compositional standards for chocolate flavour coatings and fillings. The current trapdoor beneath the legal definition of chocolate must be closed. A statutory minimum cocoa content for any product using the word chocolate in its description, including chocolate flavour, with clear mandatory declaration of the percentage of cocoa-derived ingredients. 4. Mandatory disclosure of recipe reformulations on the packaging for a minimum of 12 months following any change. When a manufacturer reduces cocoa, substitutes cocoa butter with vegetable fat, or makes any change that would alter compliance with chocolate classification standards, the packaging must carry a clear, prominent notice. Recipe changed. The current practice of quietly updating ingredients lists while maintaining identical branding, pricing, and shelf position is a systematic exercise in consumer deception. 12 months of mandatory disclosure would impose a reputational cost on reformulations that currently carry 0. 5. An end to the exemption of confectionery from meaningful sugar composition limits. There is no legal maximum sugar content for chocolate or confectionery in the UK. The government's voluntary sugar reduction programme only achieved a 3% reduction against a 20% target. Voluntary has failed. Mandatory sugar density limits for chocolate and confectionery enforced through the existing HFSS framework should replace the failed voluntary approach. 6. Mandatory testing and disclosure of PFAS, heavy metals, and microplastics in water used for confectionery manufacturing. Manufacturers using mains water as a production ingredient should be required to test for and disclose these contaminants and to publish the results as part of their food safety documentation. And 7. A Competition and Markets Authority investigation into the proportionality of confectionery price increases relative to ingredient costs. The CMA should investigate whether the UK confectionery market, dominated by 4 multinational corporations, is operating competitively, and whether the price increases imposed on British consumers are proportionate to the cost pressures claimed. This is not a story about cocoa prices. It is not a story about supply chain disruption. It's a story about what happens when the production of a nation's food is controlled by corporations whose obligations run to shareholders in another country, operating within a regulatory framework that sets its standards at the lowest level compatible with not technically lying on the label, in a market where the consumer has been given no meaningful way to compare what they receive today with what they received a decade ago. Every bar, every biscuit, every sweet, smaller, worse, and more expensive, manufactured with water that carries contaminants that nobody tests for, sold by companies that pay billions to shareholders while claiming they cannot afford real ingredients, and regulated by a system that permits the word chocolate to appear on products that contain no chocolate at all. If you found this episode useful, share it. Send it to someone who buys chocolate for their kids every week. Send it to someone who remembers what Cadbury's Dairy Milk used to taste like. Because what we have now isn't that product. And the only way to get the real one back is to demand it. Loudly, publicly, and politically. This is the 6th episode in a series examining what Britain puts into its food, its water, and its people, and what it's costing us. Please do like, subscribe, and share as far as you can. The time for change is now. Thank you.